Hey, good morning, everyone. We're finishing up John 19 today with our daily devotions. We're going to hear about Jesus' burial today, so I hope you can stick around to hear that. Make sure that you like and subscribe to our channels, and make sure you share this content if you're finding it beneficial. I mean, if you're watching it. Aren't you finding it beneficial? The text is in the description of the video and in the podcast, and if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you'll have to find it somewhere else. We're going to finish up. We're starting at verse 31. Now it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe. These things happened so that the scripture would be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And as another scripture says, they will look on the one they have pierced. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body of Jesus. Now Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because he feared the Jewish leaders. With Pilate's permission, he came and took the body away. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, the man who earlier had visited Jesus at night. Nicodemus brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. Taking Jesus' body, the two of them wrapped it with the spices and strips of linen. This was in accordance with the Jewish burial customs. At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. This is the gospel of the Lord. Now it was the day of preparation. Day of preparation was the word that's talking about the day before the Sabbath, which is Saturday. So the day of preparation is still Friday, Good Friday. And the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Remember, they're celebrating the Passover this week. The Jewish leaders don't want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath. And this may be for religious reasons, but it seems that it's probably just for more practical reasons. There's going to be a whole bunch of pilgrims coming to Jerusalem for the celebration of the Passover. And the Jewish leaders would rather not have three bodies, maybe a couple of them still alive, hanging on the cross. And so they ask that the Romans would break the legs of the men on the cross. And so they do that. They break the legs of the two guys on either side of Jesus, but they don't do that to Jesus. The reason they do this, and it maybe seems a little bit impractical, but if you understand how crucifixion happens and how someone dies, it makes more sense. Crucifixion, you didn't die from the blood loss because really, I mean, a wound in your hands and a wound in your feet isn't enough to really kill you by blood loss. And obviously you could die by lack of water, which, that could happen, but that takes multiple days. And so what actually happened to most people who died on crosses is they have their arms out like this, right? And they're hanging by these nails that are in their hands, and they have nails in their feet. And so in order to breathe, your body works like this, right? Your muscles expand your lungs, they suck in air through your nose and mouth, and then they push the air out, or the carbon dioxide that your body has now used, out in order to make room for more oxygen to come in. The problem was, as they would have their arms stretched out like this, their lungs would be stretched open, and because they were tired, their muscles would be tired. And so in order to actually squeeze their lungs, in order to get the carbon dioxide out of their lungs, they would push up with their feet. But remember, their feet are on nails, which is really, really painful. So they would do it for a while, but eventually it becomes so painful that they couldn't do it. And they would actually not be able to exhale. They could breathe in, because their arms are stretched out and their lungs could be expanded, but they couldn't actually exhale. And so the carbon dioxide that was in their lungs would suffocate them eventually. And so they would break the legs so that they couldn't push up anymore, because in some cases, guys would die on the crosses for days because they would continue to be able to breathe, right? So they break the legs, these guys die, but they don't break Jesus' legs, but they still kind of are like, well, maybe he's still alive, we just got to make sure. And part of this is because of just Romans are expert killers. They know that people need to be dead on the crosses, because if a guy gets off the cross and he's not dead, it's those soldiers who are next up on the cross. And so they think to themselves, we're going to make sure that this guy is dead. So they poke him in the side with a spear. And the reason they do this is actually really calculated. This isn't just like, poke him. They know what happens when a person dies on a cross. When they die on a cross and they suffocate, a sac of clear fluid becomes pericardial, so around your heart, so that you know that a person is dead when you poke their heart. Blood and this clear fluid, this water, will come out. That's just how your body dies when it dies of suffocation. So they poke him to find this. They go straight for the heart, they poke, and they get both the pericardial sac, and they also get the blood from the heart. And it comes out, and they say, okay, he's definitely dead. Now, obviously, this is to fulfill the scriptures, which we see from Zechariah and from a number of places that say that none of his bones are going to be broken. But there's a couple little details that I think are interesting about this piercing of the side of Jesus with the spear. First of all, it's to make sure that we know that Jesus actually died. There is a rumor, it's a really terrible explanation of what happened at this time outside of Jerusalem, that Jesus didn't actually die. He got into the tomb, and that he got out of the tomb, and that he didn't actually rise from the dead. He was just kind of swooned, and he looked like he was dead. It felt like he was dead, but then he wasn't actually dead. He got into the tomb, he got out, and then he appeared to people and said, hey, I rose from the dead. And this, of course, if this happened, would prove Christianity untrue. The problem is, with this account of the poking of the heart and seeing that clear fluid and the blood that comes out of the heart, we can know absolutely that Jesus was dead. So that throws that theory away. But there's a really cool theological significance to this as well. And the church has seen this for basically ever since it happened, as far as we can tell. Obviously, we don't have all the writings of the church, but even the ancient church fathers saw the clear fluid and the blood coming out of Jesus as representative of baptism in the Lord's Supper. In fact, there is ancient art where Jesus will be hanging on the cross, and there will be blood and water coming out of his side, and there will be either a person like receiving the water on their head, and another person like holding a cup, catching the blood as a representation of baptism and the Lord's Supper. And remember, John has been pulling these motifs through the entire Bible, through the entire book of the Bible, about blood and water as his pictures of baptism and the Lord's Supper without actually ever saying baptism and the Lord's Supper. And so we see it in its kind of culmination right here as Jesus dies, and as his benefits, his righteousness are given to his church through that death. We see baptism and the Lord's Supper, which give the forgiveness of sins. I'm skipping down to verse 35. It says, "The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you also may believe." It seems that John is talking about himself here, that he may have seen this actually happen. Now, up to verse 38. It's up. It's actually down if you're reading along, but in my Bible, it goes from there to there. So that's why I said up. I don't know. I'm human. Later, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body. Now, Joseph was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly because he feared the Jewish leaders. And Nicodemus, who we found in John chapter 3, also shows up. Same kind of situation. He's scared of the Jewish leaders, but he is a disciple of Jesus. So they ask for the body, they get the body, they wrap it up in linen with spices, which is the Jewish practice, and they bury it. Now, there are a couple things really I think we should apply to ourselves here as we see Nicodemus and Joseph. These guys were powerful men who had a lot of resources. It's obvious that Nicodemus had enough money to buy 75 pounds of spices for burial. And they didn't really live out their faith in a super bold way, right? They were fearful, they hid behind the scenes, and yet they too received the benefits of Jesus' death on the cross. The amazing grace of God is that though we want to, as Christians, be bold with our faith and live it out in the public square, and we ought to, like that's what God calls us to, the amazing grace of God is that even if we don't, God will still provide forgiveness and faith for us. That's the type of God we have, a God who is loving unconditionally, is graceful unconditionally for our benefit and for our good. So they bury him in Joseph's tomb. We found that out in another gospel. It doesn't say it here, but this is Joseph's tomb, actually, that he had for himself, which is kind of significant too, right? Jesus is buried in my tomb. I mean, my body's going to go in the ground for a while, but Jesus' death is already paid for my death. My death is not going to last. I'm going to live forever. So in a really symbolic way, Jesus goes into Joseph's tomb to say, Joseph, you're never going to have to actually stay here. I'm just going to inhabit it for you, put my death in the place of your death. And we find this also, by the way, through baptism, where in Romans 6 it says that we have been baptized into his death. So when you are baptized, you are connected to this death. Jesus fills your tomb for you so that you can live forever and not have to stay in your tomb. But there's one last thing to notice here, and John kind of gives us a little hat tip here in the last couple verses. He says, at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden was a new tomb. And that makes you think back to Genesis 1 and 2, the garden where everything was perfect, where man and woman were created in perfect unity with God and with perfect unity with each other, and yet sin broke it by the power of a tree that was eaten and brought corruption into the world. And yet in this garden, on another tree, life was given back to humanity by the death of God. And because of his death, we will live. Because he was buried in a garden, we will have the garden restored. Everything that was good that God gave to Adam and Eve, we will have it, and we will have it even more so because of the work of Jesus, his death, and his eventual resurrection, which we're going to start to hear about next time. Thanks for taking time to study this text with me. We're getting close to the end, so make sure that you're sticking with us here in the end of this story because it's the best part of the story. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you click on the links that are on the screen to see some more things that we've been doing, and I'll catch you next time.